When basketball legend Michael Jordan noticed an elderly man shooting hoops alone on a worn-down court, something made him stop his car. He had no idea this chance encounter would reveal a connection spanning 3 generations, fulfill a 60-year promise, and give an old coach one last shot at redemption. What began as a simple act of kindness would become one of the most meaningful moments in both their lives. The sun was starting to set as Michael Jordan drove his sleek black car along the quiet country road. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink. It had been a long day at the Children's Hospital in Charlotte. His hands were tired from signing hundreds of basketballs, jerseys, and photos. His face felt stiff from smiling for pictures with excited kids and their parents. But Michael didn't mind. Helping sick children was important to him. He just needed some quiet time now. He had decided to take the back roads home instead of the busy highway. The small towns and open fields of North Carolina always helped him relax. This was where he had grown up, where he had first fallen in love with basketball. Michael turned on the radio. An old soul song played softly as he tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. He was looking forward to getting home, kicking off his shoes, and watching the basketball game that was on TV tonight. As he drove through a small town called Millfield, something caught his eye. It was an old basketball court next to a community center. The court had cracks in the concrete, and the hoops were rusty. But that wasn't what made Michael slow down. It was the lone figure on the court. An elderly man stood at the free throw line. His back was slightly bent, and his movements were slow. But there was something determined in the way he held the ball. The man shot, and the ball bounced off the rim. He shuffled slowly to retrieve it, then went back to the line to try again. Michael found himself pulling over to the side of the road. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the old man kept trying, shot after shot, even though he was missing. Or maybe it was something about his form, the way he held his elbow, the careful way he lined up each shot. Just 5 minutes, Michael told himself as he turned off the engine. I'll watch for 5 minutes, then head home. He stepped out of his car, the door closing with a soft click behind him. The old man didn't seem to notice him. He was too focused on his next shot, which also bounced off the rim. Michael walked closer to the court, his expensive sneakers crunching on the gravel. The sound made the old man turn. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The old man's face was weathered, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore faded blue pants and a plain white t-shirt that had seen better days. His sneakers were worn thin. "Evening," the old man said, nodding politely. Then he turned back to the basket, as if seeing a famous basketball player at his court was nothing special. Michael smiled. "Mind if I watch?" The old man shrugged. "It's a free country." He bounced the ball a few times, then shot again. This time, the ball circled the rim before falling out. "So close," Michael said. The old man sighed. "Been so close for 60 years. He walked slowly to get the ball again. Michael noticed the man had a slight limp. Still, there was pride in the way he moved. This was a man who wouldn't accept help easily. "Your elbow's a little wide," Michael said carefully, not wanting to offend. The old man stopped and looked at him. "Excuse me." "Your shooting form," Michael explained. "If you keep your elbow in a bit more, you might have better luck." The old man studied Michael more carefully now. His eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned on his face. "Well, I'll be," he said quietly. "Michael Jordan is giving me basketball advice." Michael smiled. "Just something I noticed." The old man chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to brighten the growing darkness. "Name's Harold Wilson," he said, offering his hand. "And I know who you are. Watched every game you ever played." Michael shook his hand. Harold's grip was firm despite his age. "Try it," Michael encouraged. "Keep that elbow in." Harold positioned himself again, adjusted his elbow as Michael had suggested, and took the shot. The ball hit the backboard and fell through the net. "Well, how about that?" Harold said, looking genuinely surprised. By now, a few people walking by had noticed them. A teenage boy stopped on his bike, mouth open in shock. A woman pulling groceries from her car across the street was staring. Someone had their phone out, taking pictures. "Looks like we're drawing a crowd," Michael said. Harold nodded, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Don't want to keep you. I'm sure you've got important places to be." But Michael found he didn't want to leave. There was something about this court, about Harold, that made him curious. The way the old man shot the ball, again and again, like he was looking for something more than just making a basket. "Actually," Michael said, "I've got time. Mind if I join you?" For the first time, Harold smiled fully, revealing a gap between his front teeth. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Jordan." "Michael," he corrected. "Michael," Harold repeated as he passed him the ball. The evening light was fading fast now, casting long shadows across the cracked court. But neither man seemed to notice or care as they began to shoot baskets together in the growing twilight. The evening light was fading fast now, casting long shadows across the cracked court. But neither man seemed to notice or care as they began to shoot baskets together in the growing twilight. Michael watched as Harold took another shot. There was determination in every movement, like each basket meant more than just points. "You've got good fundamentals," Michael said, passing the ball back to Harold. "Someone taught you well." Harold nodded, bouncing the ball slowly. "Used to be better. Time takes things from you." The old court creaked beneath their feet. Weeds grew through the cracks in the concrete. The backboard was chipped, and the net was frayed, hanging by a few threads. But there was something special about this place. "Been coming to this court long?" Michael asked. Harold laughed softly. "Longer than you've been alive, son." He aimed and shot again. The ball circled the rim and fell out. "Darn it," he muttered. "What are you trying to do exactly?" Michael asked, retrieving the ball. "Trying to make the perfect shot," Harold said. "One last time." Michael raised an eyebrow. "One last time?" Harold didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to a specific spot on the court, well behind the free throw line. "From right there. That's where it has to be." Michael handed him the ball, curious. Harold hobbled to the spot and positioned himself. His face changed, becoming focused and intense. He took a deep breath, bent his knees slightly, and shot. The ball sailed through the air in a perfect arc, but hit the front of the rim and bounced away. "So close," Harold whispered. By now, the small crowd of onlookers had grown. People were whispering excitedly, pointing at Michael. Some had their phones out, recording. "Is that really Michael Jordan? What's he doing here? Who's the old man?" Harold seemed to notice the crowd for the first time and frowned. "Folks around here aren't used to seeing celebrities." "Does the attention bother you?" Michael asked. "Not the attention," Harold said. "The distraction." A young boy, about 10 years old, broke away from the crowd and ran up to them. "Mr. Jordan, can I have your autograph?" He held out a scrap of paper and a pen. Michael smiled. "Sure, buddy." He quickly signed his name. The boy looked at Harold curiously. "Are you famous too, mister?" Harold chuckled. "Not even a little bit, son." The boy's mother called him back, looking embarrassed. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. Then, looking at Harold more closely, she added, "Mr. Wilson, I didn't recognize you at first. Harold nodded politely. "Evening, Sarah. How's your father doing?" "Much better, thanks," she smiled. "He still talks about when you coached him in high school." After she left, Michael looked at Harold with new interest. "You were a coach?" "Long time ago," Harold said, dismissively. He walked to a bench at the side of the court and sat down, suddenly looking tired. Michael joined him. "This court means a lot to you, doesn't it?" Harold stared out at the faded lines and rusted hoop. "This court is my whole life, Mr. Jordan." He pulled an old, worn basketball from under the bench. It was scuffed and faded, with signatures barely visible on its surface. "First ball I ever owned," Harold explained, running his fingers over it gently. "Got it in 1955. The crowd was keeping a respectful distance now, but their presence was impossible to ignore." "Maybe we should continue this another time," Michael suggested. "When there's not so many people." Harold looked up at the darkening sky. "I suppose it is getting late." He tried to stand, but winced in pain. Michael offered his hand, which Harold reluctantly accepted. "I come here every day," Harold said, "around the same time." "Is that an invitation?" Michael asked with a smile. Harold shrugged. "Just saying, if you happen to drive by tomorrow." He paused. "But I should warn you, they're tearing this court down next week, building a shopping mall or some such nonsense." "They're demolishing it?" Michael asked, surprised. Harold nodded, his eyes sad. "Progress, they call it. Got 1 week left to make." My shot. He clutched his old basketball tightly. 1 week to finish what I started 60 years ago. Michael looked around at the old court, taking in its worn character, feeling its history. "Then we better make the most of that week," he said. For the first time that evening, Harold's face lit up with genuine hope. "See you tomorrow, then?" "Count on it," Michael said, meaning it. As they walked off the court together, the growing crowd parted to let them through, whispering and wondering what had brought Michael Jordan to their small town, and what could possibly be so special about their old, forgotten basketball court. The next day, Michael arrived at the court 15 minutes early. He had stopped at a sports store in Charlotte that morning and bought a brand new pair of basketball shoes in size 11. They were his own brand, Air Jordans, in classic black and red. He'd also picked up some athletic tape, knee braces, and a small cooler filled with water and sports drinks. The court was empty when he pulled up, so Michael took a moment to look around in the daylight. It was even more worn down than he had realized last night. The concrete was cracked in dozens of places. The backboard had chips all along its edges. The hoop was bent slightly to one side, and the net was more holes than string. Yet there was something peaceful about the place. A pair of old oak trees provided shade along one side. Birds sang in the branches. The court had obviously been loved, even if it hadn't been maintained. At exactly 3 irons, Harold appeared, walking slowly from the direction of the small houses a few blocks away. He carried his old basketball under one arm. When he spotted Michael's car, he paused for a moment, as if surprised that Michael had actually returned. "Afternoon," Harold called as he approached. "Right on time," Michael said with a smile. He held out the shoebox. "Brought you something." Harold looked at the box suspiciously. "What's this?" "Just open it." Harold set his old ball down and took the box. When he lifted the lid and saw the Air Jordans inside, his eyes widened. "Can't have you playing in those worn-out sneakers," Michael explained. "These should be more comfortable." "I can't accept these," Harold said, trying to hand the box back. "Must have cost a fortune," Michael laughed. "Let's just say I get a good discount on that particular brand." Harold hesitated, then carefully took out the shoes. "Haven't had a new pair of basketball shoes in 20 years, he admitted. "Try them on," Michael encouraged. Harold sat on the bench and slowly unlaced his old beat-up sneakers. His socks had holes in them. He looked embarrassed, but Michael pretended not to notice. Harold slipped on the new shoes and tied them carefully. "How do they feel?" Michael asked. Harold stood up and took a few experimental steps. A smile spread across his weathered face. Like walking on clouds, he bounced on his toes a couple of times. "Might add an inch to my vertical." "You might need it for that special shot of yours," Michael said. Harold's smile faded. He looked at the spot on the court he had pointed out. "Yesterday. Been trying to make that shot for longer than I care to admit." "Tell me about it," Michael said, picking up Harold's old ball. He was surprised by how heavy it was. Heavier than a regulation ball should be. Harold took the ball from him and ran his fingers over the faded signatures. "This was a gift from my high school team," he explained. "Every player signed it after our championship game in 1955. His voice grew soft with memory. "We lost that game? Because of the shot you're trying to make?" Michael guessed. Harold nodded. "Final seconds. Down by 1 point. I had the ball." He walked to the spot on the court. "Right here." Took the shot. He mimicked shooting. Missed. By just this much. He held his thumb and finger barely apart. "And you've been trying to make it ever since?" "Off and on," Harold admitted. "At first, I thought I'd move on. Got married, had kids, coached basketball at the high school." He bounced the ball slowly. "But I kept coming back to this spot. Something unfinished, you know?" Michael understood perfectly. He'd felt that same drive his whole career. The need to prove something, to finish what he started. "Let me see you. Take the shot," Michael said. Harold positioned himself, took a deep breath, and shot. The ball hit the rim and bounced away. "What am I doing wrong?" Harold asked, frustration clear in his voice. Michael studied his form. "You're leaning back slightly, and your follow-through is stopping short." They spent the next hour practicing, Michael offering gentle corrections, Harold trying to adjust his form. A few people walked by and stared, but fewer than yesterday. Word had spread that Michael Jordan wanted privacy while he worked with the old coach. "Same time every day?" Michael asked as they took a break. Harold nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "Rain or shine, hot or cold. Been my ritual for 60 years. Your family doesn't mind?" A shadow passed over Harold's face. "Wife passed 10 years ago. Kids moved away." He took a long drink from one of the sports drinks Michael had brought. "It's just me now." "What about your former players?" Michael asked. "The woman last night mentioned her father. Most moved away too. Small towns don't keep their young people." Harold looked around the empty court. "That's why they're tearing this place down. Not enough kids playing basketball anymore. Everyone's inside with their video games." Michael reached for Harold's old ball. "May I?" Harold handed it over. Michael examined it carefully. The signatures were barely visible after so many years of handling. He could make out a few names. Bobby, Jim, Coach Miller. "Coach Miller?" Michael asked. Harold smiled. "My coach. Mean old drill sergeant of a man, but he taught me everything I know about basketball." He pointed to one of the signatures. "That one there, that was Tommy Jenkins. Best point guard I ever played with. He went on to play college ball." His finger moved to another name. "And that's Billy Wilson. No relation to me. He became a doctor?" "You remember them all," Michael said, impressed. Every single one, Harold confirmed. That team was special. We came from nowhere, this tiny town, and almost won state. His eyes took on a faraway look. One shot away. As the afternoon wore on, more people gathered to watch. Some brought folding chairs and set them up at a distance. A few of the older folks called out to Harold by name. "Mr. Wilson, good to see you out here. How's the knee today, Harold? Show Michael that hook shot of yours." Harold acknowledged them with nods and short waves, but kept his focus on practice. By the time the sun started to set, he was moving better in his new shoes, and his shot was more consistent. "Same time tomorrow?" Michael asked as they finished. "Up." Harold nodded, looking at the new shoes on his feet. "Thank you for these, and for coming back. I've got nowhere else I need to be this week," Michael said, surprised to find it was true. He had canceled 2 appearances already and rescheduled a meeting with his business manager. Somehow, helping Harold make his shot had become important. As they parted ways, Harold clutched his old basketball to his chest like a treasure. "6 more days," he said, looking back at the court. "6 more days to make it right." Michael watched him walk away, his new shoes bright against the darkening sidewalk. He wondered what it would be like to carry a missed shot with you for 60 years, to keep coming back to the same spot, day after day, hoping for a different outcome. For the first time in a long time, Michael Jordan felt humbled by someone else's dedication to the game. For the first time in a long time, Michael Jordan felt humbled by someone else's dedication to the game. The next morning, Michael arrived at the court with 2 cups of coffee and a small bag of pastries from a local bakery. He'd discovered. He'd woken up early, his mind full of questions about Harold and his 60-year quest to make a single shot. When Harold arrived at precisely 3:00, he was wearing the new Air Jordans, which he'd clearly cleaned after yesterday's practice. His face brightened at the sight of the coffee. "Black, no sugar, right?" Michael asked, holding out a cup. Harold looked surprised. "How'd you know?" Michael smiled. "You strike me as a black coffee kind of man." They sat on the bench, sipping their coffee and watching a pair of sparrows hop around the court, picking at invisible crumbs. "Shoes treating you well?" Michael asked. Harold nodded. "Best I've ever worn. My knees barely hurt this morning." "I brought something else that might help," Michael said, reaching into his car. He pulled out a small gym bag and removed a knee brace. "This might give you more stability for that shot." Harold accepted the brace with a nod of thanks. As he rolled up his pant leg to put it on, Michael noticed a long scar running down his knee. "Old basketball injury?" Michael asked. Harold shook his head. "Korea, 1951. You fought in the Korean War? Didn't do much fighting, mostly just tried not to freeze to death." Harold adjusted the brace. "Got this when our truck flipped on an icy road. Ended my college basketball dreams right there." "You had a scholarship?" Michael asked. "NC State," Harold said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Coach Case himself came to see me play. Offered me a spot that same night." His eyes grew distant. 2 weeks later, I was on a ship headed for Korea." "That's tough," Michael said. "That's life," Harold replied without bitterness. "When I got back, I had a bum knee and a family that needed supporting. College wasn't in the cards anymore." They finished their coffee in silence. Then Harold stood up, testing the knee brace. "Feels good," he said. "Let's see if it helps my shot." They began their practice routine. Harold seemed more focused today, his movements more fluid despite his age. Michael could see glimpses of the player he must have been in his youth. Quick hands, good balance, natural instincts. "Tell me about your team," Michael said as they took a break. The one from 1955. Harold's face lit up. Best group of boys I ever coached. None of them over 6 feet tall, but they played like giants. He pointed to different spots on the court. Tommy Jenkins could hit from anywhere beyond the arc, before there even was an arc. Billy Wilson was our defensive specialist. Quick, hands, always in the right position. And Johnny Miller. Harold shook his head in admiration. That boy could jump so high, you'd swear his feet never touched the ground. The championship game, Michael prompted. What happened? Harold took a long breath. State finals against Richardson High. They had 2 players already signed to Duke. He walked to the spot where he'd been practicing his shot. We were down by 1, 10 seconds left. I called our final timeout. He demonstrated as he talked, moving his hands like he was diagramming a play. I designed a play for Tommy, our best shooter. But Richardson doubled him immediately. Johnny had the ball, couldn't find an open man. The clock was running down. Harold's voice grew more intense. Then he saw me, just for a split second, right here. He tapped his foot on the spot. I was open. He passed. I shot. Harold mimicked the shot, his old hands tracing the arc of a ball long gone. Missed. By this much. He held his fingers an inch apart. That's a tough break, Michael said. Wasn't just a tough break, Harold replied. It was the last game I ever played. Next day, I became the coach. How did that happen? Coach Miller had a heart attack right after the game. Stress, the doctor said. He survived, but couldn't coach anymore. Harold bounced the ball slowly. Team voted for me to take over. I was 19 years old, coaching boys not much younger than me. Michael was impressed. And you kept coaching all these years? 42 years, Harold confirmed. Retired in '97 when my wife got sick. They resumed practice, working on the specific shot that had haunted Harold for 6 decades. Michael noticed that Harold kept looking at his pocket watch every few minutes. Expecting someone? Michael asked after an hour. Harold looked embarrassed. Doc says I shouldn't overdo it. Art's not what it used to be. Michael nodded, understanding. Let's take another break then. They sat on the bench, watching as more people gathered to observe their practice. The crowd was larger today, but still respectful of their space. You coached any of their kids? Michael asked, nodding toward the onlookers. Most of them, Harold said. Some of their grandkids, too. He pointed to a middle-aged man at the edge of the crowd. That's Robbie Stevens. Played for me in the '80s. Made All-State. The man waved, and Harold waved back. And that woman there, with the red hair? That's Lisa Thompson. Best girls player this town ever produced. Went to Chapel Hill on a full ride. Michael was beginning to understand Harold's place in this community. He wasn't just an old man with an obsession. He was a cornerstone, someone who had shaped generations of young athletes. Did you ever think about coaching at the college level? Michael asked. With your knowledge of the game, you could have gone far. Harold shook his head. Had chances. UNC assistant job in '72, Davidson head coach in '78. He looked around at the small town, the familiar faces. But this was home. These were my people. Couldn't leave them. A young boy broke away from the crowd and approached them, clutching a basketball. He looked nervous. Mr. Wilson, the boy said, my grandpa says you taught him how to shoot free throws. Could you teach me too? Harold looked at the boy, then at Michael, silently asking if he minded the interruption. Go ahead, Michael said with a smile. I could use the rest. For the next 20 minutes, Michael watched as Harold patiently showed the boy how to position his feet, how to hold the ball, how to follow through with his shot. Harold's voice was gentle but firm, his instructions clear and simple. The boy improved visibly with each attempt. "You're a natural teacher," Michael said when the boy returned to his grandfather. Harold shrugged. "Basketball's simple when you strip away all the fancy stuff. It's about fundamentals, discipline, and heart." He gave Michael a significant look. "Something you know a thing or two about." Michael nodded, appreciating the compliment. "Ready to try your shot again?" Harold walked to his spot, the weight of 60 years of attempts visible in his careful stance. He took a deep breath, bent his knees slightly, and shot. The ball sailed through the air in a perfect arc. It hit the rim, circled once, twice, and fell out. Harold's shoulders slumped. "5 more days," he said quietly. Michael put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get there," he promised. "Tomorrow, I want you to bring something." "What's that?" Harold asked. "Pictures, newspaper clippings, anything you have from your coaching days. I want to see the teams you worked with." "Got a whole box of that stuff," Harold admitted. "Wife called it my brag box. Haven't opened it in years." "Bring it," Michael said. "I want to hear more of your stories." As they parted ways, Michael watched Harold walk away, his new shoes still bright, his steps a little lighter despite the missed shot. In just 3 days, this old man and his dedicated ritual had begun to change something in Michael, reminding him why he fell in love with basketball in the first place. It wasn't about the fame or the championships. It was about the pure joy of the game, the connections it created, and the lives it changed, one shot at a time. It wasn't about the fame or the championships. It was about the pure joy of the game, the connections it created, and the lives it changed, one shot at a time. The next day, dark clouds hung over Millfield. The air felt heavy with coming rain. Michael arrived at the court with an umbrella and a thermos of hot coffee, wondering if Harold would still show up in this weather. At exactly 3 ARG, Harold appeared, walking slowly through the misty drizzle. He carried a worn cardboard box under one arm, protected from the rain by a plastic shopping bag. His other hand clutched a black umbrella. "Thought you might not come," Michael said, pouring coffee into 2 paper cups. "Haven't missed a day in 30 years, Harold replied. "Not for rain, not for snow." He set the box down carefully on the bench beneath his umbrella. "Brought my brag box, like you asked." They sat huddled under their umbrellas as the rain fell, softly around them. Harold removed the plastic covering and opened the box. Inside were photo albums, newspaper clippings, and an old leather-bound notebook. Harold pulled out the notebook first. "My playbook," he explained. "Started it my first year of coaching. Added to it every season." Michael accepted the notebook with reverence. The leather was cracked with age, the pages yellowed. As he opened it, he found diagrams of basketball plays, carefully drawn by hand. Notes filled the margins, observations about players' strengths and weaknesses, strategies for specific opponents. "This is incredible," Michael said, turning the pages. "You documented everything." Harold nodded. "Basketball's always evolving. Had to keep up." He pointed to a page from the late 1980s. "That's when I started studying your games. Changed my whole approach to offense." Michael was surprised to find several pages dedicated to his playing style. Harold had broken down his moves in remarkable detail. The famous fadeaway jumper, the defensive stance, even the way he used his eyes to fake out defenders. "You studied me that closely?" Michael asked. "Studied everyone," Harold said. "Magic, Bird, Isaiah, but you," he tapped the notebook. "You were special. Changed the game forever." Harold reached into the box and pulled out newspaper clippings preserved in plastic sleeves. Headlines from the local paper chronicled his coaching career. Wilson's Wildcats win regional championship. Coach Wilson celebrates 300th victory. Wilson named Coach of the Year for third time. Below, these were photos of teams, groups of smiling young men and women in basketball uniforms, Harold standing proudly with them, gradually aging from picture to picture. "This was my first championship team," Harold said, pointing to a black and white photo from 1960. "And this was my last," he added, showing a color photo from 1996. As Michael looked through the album, he noticed something. "You kept all the runner-up photos too." "Not just the championships," Harold nodded. "Every team matters. Every season matters." He turned to a page showing a team that clearly hadn't won many games. "This bunch went 3-19, my worst season ever." But two of these boys went on to become doctors. One's a judge now. The rain fell harder, drumming on their umbrellas. The court was empty except for them, their voices nearly drowned out by the sound of the downpour. "We can't practice in this," Michael said. "No," Harold agreed. "But maybe it's good to rest the old bones for a day." He pulled out more items from the box. A whistle on a frayed lanyard, championship rings from high school tournaments, letters from former players thanking him for his guidance. One folder contained news clippings about Michael's own career. Harold had followed him since his days at North Carolina. "You're quite the fan," Michael observed. "Not just a fan," Harold corrected, "a student of greatness." Harold opened to a specific page in his notebook. It contained diagrams of defensive strategies, with Michael's name written at the top. "Used these to teach my players how to defend against perimeter threats," Harold explained. "Never worked, of course. No one could stop you." Michael laughed. "Plenty of teams figured it out." Harold shook his head. "They slowed you down, never stopped you." As they talked basketball, Michael began to see how deep Harold's knowledge ran. He wasn't just an old man with fading dreams. He was a basketball genius who had dedicated his life to understanding the game at its most fundamental level. "Why didn't you ever try to publish this?" Michael asked, holding up the notebook. "Coaches would pay good money for these insights." Harold shrugged. "Never wrote it for anyone but myself and my players." The rain began to ease. Harold looked out at the wet court, his eyes fixed on that special spot. "4 more days," he said quietly. "We'll be ready," Michael assured him. "Weather should be better tomorrow." Harold carefully repacked his box of memories. As he did, a small photograph fell out. Michael picked it up. It showed a much younger Harold standing next to an older man in a coach's outfit. "Your coach?" Michael asked. Harold nodded, taking the photo. "Coach Miller. Toughest man I ever knew, but fair." He stared at the photo for a long moment. "He believed in me when no one else did." Michael sensed there was more to the story, but Harold tucked the photo away without elaborating. "Same time tomorrow?" Michael asked as they prepared to leave. "Always," Harold replied. "Rain or shine." As Michael watched Harold walk away, clutching his precious box of memories, he realized that this wasn't just about helping an old man make a basket. It was about honoring a lifetime devoted to a game they both loved. And for the first time, Michael truly wanted Harold to make that shot. Not for himself, but for Coach Miller, for all the teams in those photographs, and for every life Harold had touched along the way. And for the first time, Michael truly wanted Harold to make that shot. Not for himself, but for Coach Miller, for all the teams in those photographs, and for every life Harold had touched along the way. The next day dawned bright and clear. The rain had washed away the summer dust, leaving the world looking fresh and new. When Michael arrived at the court, he was surprised to find a small crowd already gathered. People sat in folding chairs. Some had brought coolers and snacks. It looked like they were settling in for the afternoon. "What's going on?" Michael asked a woman who was setting up a lawn chair. "Word's gotten out about you and Coach Wilson," she explained. "The whole town's talking about it. People want to see him make that shot." Michael wasn't sure how Harold would feel about all this attention. The old coach valued his privacy, especially when practicing. At 3 sharp, Harold appeared, wearing his Air Jordans and carrying his special ball. He stopped when he saw the crowd, his expression a mixture of surprise and dismay. "Quite an audience," Michael said as Harold reached him. "Too many distractions," Harold muttered. Michael nodded. "Want me to ask them to leave?" Harold considered this, then sighed. "No, they mean well." He looked at the faces in the crowd. "Most of them are my former players or their families. I owe them something too." They began their practice routine, with Harold taking shots from his special spot and Michael offering adjustments and encouragement. The crowd watched quietly, occasionally clapping when Harold came close to making the basket. After about 30 minutes, a sleek black car pulled up beside the court. A man in an expensive suit got out, followed by 2 others carrying camera equipment. Michael recognized the logo on their jackets, a major sports network. "Mr. Jordan," the man called, approaching with his hand extended. "Greg Thompson, ESPN. We heard you were working with a local basketball legend." He glanced at Harold. "Mind if we get some footage? Human interest story?" Before Michael could answer, Harold stepped forward. "I mind," he said firmly. "This isn't a show." The reporter looked taken aback. "But sir, this could be a great opportunity to—" "No cameras," Harold insisted. Greg Thompson looked at Michael, clearly hoping he would override the old man's objections. But Michael shook his head. "You heard the coach," he said. "No cameras." The reporter seemed ready to argue, but something in Michael's expression made him reconsider. "Maybe just a quick interview then? Off camera?" "We're practicing," Michael said firmly. "Maybe another time." As the disappointed news crew retreated to their car, a murmur went through the crowd. Michael heard snippets of conversation. "Did you see how he stood up for Coach? Just like old times, Coach Wilson never let anybody interrupt practice." Harold was already back at his spot, focusing on his next shot. Michael rejoined him, rebounding as Harold tried again and again to make the basket. "Thanks," Harold said quietly between shots. "Never did like cameras." "No problem," Michael replied. "Though you might be missing your chance at fame." Harold snorted. "Fame is overrated. Ask anyone who has it." Michael smiled, knowing Harold was right. As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived. Michael noticed that many of them greeted Harold by name, often approaching to shake his hand or share a quick memory. These interruptions clearly frustrated Harold, but he was unfailingly polite, briefly acknowledging each person before returning to his practice. During a water break, Michael heard a commotion at the edge of the crowd. An elderly man in a wheelchair was being helped through the gathering, people making way respectfully. "Who's that?" Michael asked. Harold's face broke into a genuine smile. "Johnny Miller," he said. "My point guard from 55. Johnny Miller's wheelchair was pushed by a middle-aged man who was clearly his son. Despite his frail appearance, Johnny's eyes were sharp and alert. When he saw Harold, he raised a gnarled hand in greeting. "Still trying to make that shot, Harold?" Johnny called, his voice surprisingly strong. "Still trying," Harold confirmed, walking over to greet his old teammate. Michael followed, curious about this reunion. Johnny looked up at him with undisguised admiration. "Michael Jordan himself?" Johnny said, shaking his head in wonder. "Never thought I'd see the day." He turned to Harold. You always said you'd get the best to help you make that shot. Guess you weren't kidding. Johnny was the one who passed me the ball, Harold explained to Michael. Johnny nodded. Perfect. Pass too. Right in the shooting pocket. He looked at Harold with a mischievous grin. Shame about your follow-through, Harold laughed. 60 years later, and he's still criticizing my form. There was an easy camaraderie between the two old friends that spoke of decades of shared history. Michael felt privileged to witness it. How? Many days left? Johnny asked, his expression growing serious. 3, Harold replied. Johnny glanced at the "Coming Soon" sign at the edge of the property. Shame about the court. Lot of memories here. Working on making one more, Harold said. Johnny reached up and grabbed Harold's arm. You'll make it. I've been watching you try for 60 years. About time the ball went in. After Johnny was wheeled back to his spot among the spectators, Harold seemed more focused than ever. His shots came closer, one even spinning around the rim for a full second before falling out. That's the one, Michael said. You're getting closer. By late afternoon, the crowd had grown to nearly 100 people. Some had brought food to share, turning the practice session into something of a community event. Children played at the edges of the court, occasionally stopping to watch Harold shoot. A young woman approached Michael while Harold was taking a break. Mr. Jordan, she said hesitantly. I'm Lisa Thompson. Coach Wilson trained me. He mentioned you, Michael said. Said you went to Chapel Hill. Lisa beamed with pride. He remembers. He remembers all his players, Michael assured her. That's why we're all here, Lisa said, gesturing to the crowd. Word spread that the court's being demolished. People wanted to come say goodbye, share their memories. She looked at Harold with obvious affection. And to support Coach. That shot means everything to him. As the sun began to set, Harold took his final attempts of the day. The crowd grew quiet, watching with collective hope as each shot came close, but didn't go in. When Harold finally called it quits, there was a smattering of supportive applause. 3 more days, someone called out. You'll get it, Coach. Harold acknowledged the encouragement with a tired wave. As he and Michael prepared to leave, Harold looked out at the gathered community. His former players, their children, their grandchildren. Didn't expect this, he said quietly. You touched a lot of lives, Michael replied. Harold shook his head, his expression a mixture of gratitude and something like grief. Just did my job. Taught basketball. You taught more than basketball, Michael said. I can see it in their faces. As they walked off the court together, people reached out to touch Harold's shoulder or shake his hand. Michael hung back, giving the old coach his moment with his community. And he realized that whether or not Harold ever made that shot, his legacy was already secured in the hearts of everyone gathered there. And he realized that whether or not Harold ever made that shot, his legacy was already secured in the hearts of everyone gathered there. The next morning, Michael arrived to find the court transformed. Someone had hung colorful banners along the fence. A few tables had been set up with refreshments. A hand-painted sign read, Coach Wilson Appreciation Day. Harold wasn't there yet, but already more than 200 people milled around the edges of the court. Michael recognized many faces from yesterday. Former players, local families, elderly folks who had known Harold for decades. Mr. Jordan, a middle-aged woman, approached him. I'm Mayor Jenkins. Thank you for what you're doing for Coach Wilson. I'm just rebounding, Michael said modestly. The mayor smiled. You're giving him a chance to finish something important. This whole town appreciates that. As they talked, a large black SUV pulled up to the court. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, flanked by 2 others carrying briefcases. He surveyed the gathering with obvious displeasure. "Who's that?" Michael asked. The mayor's expression darkened. "Richard Colton, the developer who bought this property. Owns half the county now." Richard Colton strode directly to the mayor, ignoring the hostile glances from the crowd. "What's going on here, Helen?" he demanded. "This is private property now." "Community gathering," the mayor replied calmly. "Just saying goodbye to a local landmark." Colton gestured at the banners and tables. "This looks like a protest to me." "No protest," the mayor assured him. "Just a celebration of Coach Wilson's contributions to our town." Colton looked skeptical. He noticed Michael and did a double-take. "You're Michael Jordan." Michael nodded but didn't offer his hand. "What are you doing here?" Colton asked. "Helping an old friend practice his shot," Michael replied. Colton looked confused. "Old friend? Coach Wilson?" Before Michael could answer, the crowd parted. Harold had arrived, dressed in his usual simple clothes, but wearing his Air Jordans. He stopped when he saw the banners and the crowd, clearly embarrassed by the attention. "Harold," Colton called, walking over to him. "I didn't realize you had such famous friends." Harold nodded stiffly. "Mr. Colton, I came to let everyone know we're moving up the demolition schedule," Colton announced loudly. "The equipment will be here tomorrow morning." A murmur of protest ran through the crowd. The mayor stepped forward. "You agreed to wait until Monday," she reminded him. "Plans change," Colton said with a shrug. "The contractor had an opening." Michael watched Harold's face. The old coach had gone pale, his hands tightening around his basketball. "2 more days," Harold said quietly. "That's all I'm asking." Colton looked unmoved. "The decision's been made. This place will be cleared by tomorrow afternoon." Something stirred in Michael. He had seen enough powerful men like Colton in his career, men who couldn't see beyond dollar signs to the human cost of their decisions. "What if we made a deal?" Michael suggested, stepping forward. Colton raised an eyebrow. "What kind of deal?" "Oh, challenge," Michael said. "If Coach Wilson can make his shot by sundown tomorrow, you delay the demolition until the original date." "And why would I agree to that?" Colton asked. Michael gestured around at the gathered community, many of whom were now recording the conversation on their phones. "Good publicity. Show everyone that Richard Colton cares about local traditions." Colton considered this, clearly weighing the PR benefits. "And if he misses? Then you get your demolition, with no complaints from anyone here," Michael said, though he could see from the faces in the crowd that this wasn't a promise they were eager to keep. "Michael," Harold protested quietly, "don't put yourself in the middle of this." But Colton was already considering the offer. 1 shot by sundown tomorrow? 1 specific shot, Michael clarified, from a specific spot. "Show me," Colton demanded. Harold reluctantly walked to his spot on the court. "From here," Colton scoffed. "That's a nearly impossible shot for a man your age." Harold's back straightened. "I've made harder shots in my time." The crowd had gone completely silent, watching the negotiation. "What do you say, Mr. Colton?" the mayor pressed. "Surely you can spare 1 more day." Colton looked around at the phones recording him, at the faces of the community members, and finally at Michael Jordan standing supportively beside an old basketball. "Coach, fine," he said at last. 1 shot by sundown tomorrow. If he makes it, I'll stick to the original demolition date. If he misses, the bulldozers come in Friday morning." A cheer went up from the crowd. Harold looked relieved but also terrified. The pressure of making the shot had just increased enormously. "Thank you," Michael said to Colton, not offering his hand. Colton adjusted his tie. "I'll be here tomorrow to witness the attempt." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and I'm bringing my son. He's a big fan of yours, Mr. Jordan." After Colton left, the crowd swarmed around Harold, offering encouragement and support. Michael pulled him aside. "I'm sorry," Michael said. "I shouldn't have put that pressure on you." Harold took a deep breath. "No, you did right. At least now I have a chance." He looked out at the court, at his special spot. One more day to make it right. They practiced with renewed intensity that afternoon. The crowd stayed, watching every shot, groaning when Harold missed, cheering when he came close. As the hours passed, Harold grew visibly tired. His shots began to fall short. "You need to rest," Michael insisted. Harold shook his head stubbornly. "Can't afford to rest. Not now. If you wear yourself out today, you won't have anything left for tomorrow," Michael pointed out. "Trust me on this. I know something about performing under pressure." Finally, Harold agreed. As they were packing up, Johnny Miller's son wheeled him over. "You're going to make it, Harold," Johnny said confidently. "I feel it." Harold managed to smile. "Hope you're right, Johnny." "I was there when you missed it," Johnny reminded him. "Only fair that I'm here when you make it." As they prepared to leave, Lisa Thompson approached with a small group of former players. "Coach," she said, "we thought you might want to have dinner with us tonight. Get your mind off tomorrow." Harold looked touched. "That's kind of you." "We've reserved the back room at Miller's Diner," one of the other former players added. "Like we used to do after big games." Harold looked at Michael questioningly. "Go," Michael encouraged. "They need this as much as you do." Harold nodded. "Join us," he asked Michael. Michael shook his head. "This is your time with your players. I have some calls to make anyway." He patted Harold's shoulder. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's the big game, as a Tuyudai." Michael watched Harold leave, surrounded by his former players. He thought about what this shot truly meant. It wasn't just about a ball going through a hoop. It was about redemption, about second chances, about finishing what had been started long ago. Michael walked to the spot where Harold had been practicing. He picked up the ball and took the shot himself. It sailed through the air and went in, cleanly. Mathematically, physically, it was a makeable shot. The question was whether Harold's aging body could execute what his mind and heart so desperately wanted. As the sun set on the old court, Michael found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He said a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for an old coach with one last dream. "Just one shot," he whispered to the empty court. "Just one perfect shot." "Just one shot," he whispered to the empty court. "Just one perfect shot." Michael arrived early the next morning. The sky was a perfect blue without a single cloud. A good omen, he hoped. He set up a small practice area with water, towels, and a chair for Harold to rest on. Today would be different. Today, everything had to be perfect. Harold arrived at his usual time, 3 p.m. sharp. He looked more rested than yesterday, but his eyes held a nervous energy Michael hadn't seen before. "Good dinner?" Michael asked as they began warming up. Harold nodded. "Old stories, good memories." He bounced the ball slowly. "All those players, gathered in one room, made me realize how lucky I've been." They began their practice routine, but something felt off. Harold's shots were missing by wider margins than usual. His hands seemed unsteady. "Pressure getting to you?" Michael asked gently after a particularly bad miss. Harold sighed. "Used to be better at handling it." Michael understood. Even the greatest athletes could crumble under pressure. He had seen it happen to teammates, to rivals, even to himself on rare occasions. "Tell me something," Michael said, trying to distract Harold from his nerves. "There's more to this shot than you've told me, isn't there? Something beyond missing the championship?" Harold stopped bouncing the ball. He looked at Michael for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the something that had made that crinkling sound days ago. It was an old photograph, folded and refolded so many times that the creases were permanent. "Take a look," Harold said, carefully unfolding it. The photo showed a young Harold in his basketball uniform standing next to a middle-aged man in a coach's outfit, Coach Miller. They were smiling, Harold holding a basketball, the coach's arm around his shoulders. "Nice picture," Michael said, "but I've seen it before, in your box of memories." Harold shook his head. "Look at the background." Michael looked more closely. Behind Harold and Coach Miller was a basketball court. This basketball court, but newer, fresher. And in the corner of the photo, partly visible, was a scoreboard showing the final score of a game. Millfield 68, Richardson 70. "This was taken right after the championship game?" Michael asked. "After you missed the shot?" Harold nodded. "Minutes after the biggest disappointment of my life. Look at my face." Michael studied the photo again. Young Harold was indeed smiling, but there was pain in his eyes, visible even in the faded photograph. "Coach Miller insisted on this picture," Harold explained. "Said someday I'd want to remember this moment." "Why would he think that?" Harold took a deep breath. "Because of what he told me right after I missed. The secret he shared." Michael waited, sensing they were finally reaching the heart of Harold's 60-year quest. "Coach pulled me aside while everyone was crying," Harold continued. "Told me he'd missed the exact same shot from the exact same spot in his championship game 20 years earlier." He shook his head in wonder. History repeating itself. "That's why he made you coach," Michael realized. "Not just that," Harold said. "He made me promise something. Said that someday I'd make that shot. Not in a game, that chance was gone, but on this court, to prove it was possible." He looked at his spot with renewed determination. To break the cycle. "Did Coach Miller ever make it?" Michael asked. Harold's expression grew sad. He tried for years. His heart gave out before he could. His last words to me were, "Make the shot, Harold. Make it for both of us." Now Michael understood the full weight of Harold's burden. This wasn't just about redemption for himself. It was about fulfilling a promise to his mentor, about breaking a chain of regret that stretched back almost 80 years. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Michael asked. Harold shrugged. "Some promises are too personal to share easily." He folded the photo carefully and returned it to his pocket. "But now you know." They resumed practice with new purpose. Something had changed in Harold's demeanor. The nervous energy was gone, replaced by calm focus. His shots began to come closer, one even hitting the back of the rim and bouncing straight up before falling out. "That's it," Michael encouraged. "Find that rhythm." The crowd began to gather as the afternoon wore on. By 4:00 p.m., hundreds of people surrounded the court. Michael noticed Johnny Miller in his wheelchair, Lisa Thompson and other former players, the mayor, and dozens of families with children. And then Richard Colton arrived with his son, a boy of about 12 who looked excited to see Michael Jordan in person. "Remember our deal," Colton called out. "One shot by sundown." Michael checked the time. They had about 3 more hours of daylight, plenty of time for practice. Harold took a break, sipping water and wiping sweat from his forehead. His hand trembled slightly. "You okay?" Michael asked, concerned. "Just tired," Harold assured him. Old heart doesn't pump like it used to. Michael frowned. Maybe we should have a doctor check you out. No time for that, Harold said firmly. I'm fine. They continued practicing, but Michael kept a close eye on Harold's condition. The old coach was pushing himself hard, perhaps too hard. After another hour, Harold's face had gone pale, and he was breathing heavily. That's enough practice, Michael insisted. Save your strength for the actual attempt. Harold didn't argue, which worried Michael even more. They sat on the bench together, watching as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. When do you want to take the shot? Michael asked. Harold looked up at the sun. Not yet. Need the light to be just right. Just right for what? When I missed, the sun was in my eyes, Harold explained. Same for Coach Miller when he missed his shot. Michael understood. Harold wanted everything to be different this time, to break the pattern completely. As they waited, Johnny Miller's son wheeled him over. Mind if we join you? Johnny asked. Harold gestured to the space beside them. Always room for my point guard. Johnny looked at Harold with concern. You don't look so good, old friend. Just tired, Harold said again. Been waiting a long time for this. Johnny reached over and took Harold's hand in his. Whatever happens, we're proud of you. The whole town is. Harold's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thanks, Johnny. More people came by to offer encouragement. Former players, parents of children Harold had coached, even Richard Colton's son, who shyly asked for autographs from both Michael and Harold. Both of us? Harold asked, surprised. Dad says you're a legend around here, the boy explained. Harold signed the boy's basketball with a shaky hand, clearly moved by the gesture. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the court, Harold stood up. It's time, he said. A hush fell over the crowd. Harold walked slowly to his spot, the one he had shot from thousands of times over 60 years. Michael handed him his special ball, the one with the faded signatures of his teammates. One perfect shot, Michael said softly. Harold nodded, his face set in lines of determination. For Coach Miller, he whispered. For the team, for all of them. And as he prepared to take the most important shot of his life, Harold reached into his pocket once more, removing the photo and pressing it briefly to his heart. The secret was out, the promise revealed. Now, all that remained was one last chance to fulfill it. And as he prepared to take the most important shot of his life, Harold reached into his pocket once more, removing the photo and pressing it briefly to his heart. The secret was out, the promise revealed. Now all that remained was one last chance to fulfill it. Harold handed the photo to Michael. Hold this for me, he said quietly. Michael accepted it carefully, feeling the weight of its significance. The crowd had fallen completely silent. Even the children, who had been playing at the edges of the gathering, now stood still, sensing the importance of the moment. Richard Colton checked his watch impatiently, but said nothing. Harold bounced the ball 3 times, just as he had thousands of times before. His face was a mask of concentration. Years of disappointment and determination etched in every line. Michael watched, holding his breath. He had witnessed countless, crucial moments in basketball, championship-winning shots, career-defining plays, impossible comebacks. But somehow, this felt more important than any of them. Harold raised the ball, his form perfect despite his age, his elbow tucked in, exactly as Michael had advised on that first day. His knees bent slightly, finding strength that belied his. 82 years, and then Pain flashed across Harold's face. The ball slipped from his fingers, bouncing away as Harold clutched at his chest, staggering backward. "Harold!" Michael lunged forward, catching the old coach before he could fall. A gasp went up from the crowd. Johnny Miller called out his friends, name in alarm. Someone shouted for a doctor. "I'm okay," Harold insisted, though his face had gone gray. "Just a twinge." But Michael could feel how heavily Harold was leaning on him, could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool, evening air. "We need to get you to a hospital," Michael said firmly. Harold shook his head. "No, not yet." His eyes found his spot on the court, the ball lying abandoned nearby. "I have to make the shot first." "Harold, your health is more important than—" "Please," Harold interrupted, his voice breaking. "Just help me try once more." Michael looked at Harold's pale face, at the determination still burning in his eyes, despite the pain. He understood then that this shot had defined Harold's life for so long that he couldn't let it go, even now. "One try," Michael agreed reluctantly. "Then we're getting you checked out. No arguments." He helped Harold back to his spot and retrieved the ball. A doctor from the crowd had made his way to the court's edge, watching with concern but respecting Harold's wish to continue. Harold took the ball, breathing deeply. The pain seemed to recede, or perhaps he was simply pushing through it with sheer willpower. "You can do this," Michael said, stepping back to give Harold space. Harold nodded, his focus returning. He bounced the ball once, twice, 3 times. The ritual calmed him, centered him. The crowd, the pain, the pressure, all of it fell away, until there was only Harold, the ball, and the basket. He bent his knees, raised the ball, and shot. The ball sailed through the air in a perfect arc. Time seemed to slow down. Michael could see the slight rotation of the ball, could trace its trajectory as it reached the apex of its flight and began to descend. It struck the back of the rim, bounced up, and went in. For a split second, there was complete silence. Then, the crowd erupted in cheers. Johnny Miller raised his arms in triumph. Lisa Thompson and the other former players rushed onto the court. Harold stood motionless, staring at the basket as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. Then a smile spread across his weathered face, and tears filled his eyes. "I made it," he whispered. "After all these years." Michael clapped him on the shoulder. "You made it." Harold turned to Michael, his expression a mix of joy, relief, and profound gratitude. "Couldn't have done it without you." "All I did was rebound," Michael said. "You made the shot." Richard Colton approached, his expression unreadable. A deal," he acknowledged. "Demolition stays on the original schedule." "That gives us the weekend," the mayor said, joining them. "Time for a proper goodbye." Harold nodded, but his face had gone pale again. The excitement had been too much. He wobbled on his feet, and Michael steadied him. "Now we're going to the hospital," Michael insisted, no room for argument in his voice. This time, Harold didn't protest. As Michael helped him toward his car, Harold suddenly stopped. "The photo," he reminded Michael. "Don't forget it." Michael pulled the old photograph from his pocket, intending to hand it back to Harold. But as he looked at it again, something caught his eye. In the background of the photo, partly visible behind Coach Miller, was another man, older, watching the young Harold with unmistakable pride. "Harold," Michael said slowly, "who's that man behind Coach Miller?" Harold looked at the photo, his expression softening. "That's Coach Miller's mentor, the man who taught him everything he knew about basketball." Michael stared at the photo, a strange feeling washing over him. There was something familiar about the man's profile, about the way he stood. His name was James Jordan, Harold said. No relation to you, I expect, but a fine basketball mind. Michael's heart skipped a beat. James Jordan. His grandfather's name. Could it be possible? He looked more closely at the man in the photo, seeing now the resemblance to his own father. To himself. My grandfather played college basketball in North Carolina, Michael said quietly. Coached a little after that, before becoming a factory worker. Harold's eyes widened. Your grandfather? Michael nodded, the pieces falling into place. He never talked much about his coaching days. Always said he learned more from failure than success. Harold's hand trembled as he took the photo back, staring at it with new understanding. All these years, you don't think that's something more than coincidence brought me to this court? Michael finished. I don't know, but I'm glad it did. As they made their way to the car, surrounded by the celebrating community, Michael thought about the strange connections that had brought him here, to this small town, to this old court, to Harold Wilson and his lifetime quest. The shot had been made. The cycle was broken, and somehow 3 generations had been there to see it happen. Harold, who made the shot, Coach Miller, present in spirit, and Michael himself, the grandson of the man who had started it all. Harold had come to the court alone for 60 years, trying to make that shot. But in the end, he hadn't been alone at all. He'd been part of something larger, a story that had begun before him and would continue long after. And as the sun set on the old basketball court, Michael understood that sometimes the most important shots in life aren't the ones that win championships or make the highlight reels. Sometimes they're the ones that heal old wounds, fulfill promises, and connect generations through the simple, perfect arc of a basketball in flight. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so leave a comment below. For another inspiring story that will move you just as much, click the video appearing on your screen right now.